welcome to our one and only summer reading lecture for this summer. Last year we had a whole lecture series on cryptids, but this summer we went for exercise. So the theme of our summer reading program this year was Color Your World, and music is part of how we color our world. So we've had 3 line dancing lessons on every other Tuesday. So the next one is the very last one is this coming Tuesday, July 22nd at 5 p.m. It's the last of our free line dancing programs for the summer. So if you would like to dance, come to the library this Tuesday, July 22nd at 5 p.m. And then on Wednesdays we've been having cardio drumming, which I should have brought them all, but you would have walked past one right on your way in here. It involves hitting the ball and the drum that it sits on, and it's all choreographed, and people have been having a lot of fun with that. That is this next Wednesday, and the following Wednesday we have 2 more of those programs left at 6 p.m. So those were our summer reading programs for teens and adults this year, and then this lecture as well, the trainings that became the B&O. So today's program will explore the history of the 2 railroads, or I should say the 2, I should say 2 of the railroads that eventually became the B&O. For the first part of today's presentation, Michael Kole will lecture on the Cleveland, Lorain, wheeling line, and then later we'll hear from local historian Dan Frizzi, who will talk about the Central Ohio Railroad. Our first speaker today, Michael Kole, has been married for 56 years to his wife Judith. They have 2 children and 4 grandchildren. Michael retired from the Ohio Bell Telephone Company after 37 years of service. He went to work for the Wheeling and Lake Erie Railroad Company and is both a certified locomotive engineer and conductor, and was also qualified on both the CSX and Norfolk and Southern Railway. He is now retired, but he co-funded and was president of the Cleveland Commercial Railway Company, a freight railroad with 23 miles of track, and the Cleveland Harbor Belt Railway Company, a switching railroad for the Port of Cleveland. His hobbies include aviation. He's a commercial pilot with an instrument rating. On railroads, he's a member of several railroad organizations, and particularly knowledgeable about the Cleveland area railroads and history, especially local history, with an interest in the Ohio and Erie Canal. Most of all, he enjoys meeting people, so thank you all for coming today to hear him speak on the Cleveland, Lorain, and wheeling line. Everybody, please welcome Michael Kole. Yes.
There, now I think you can hear me.
We're good.
Thank you, Eric.
You're welcome.
Aaron is being too honest because not only did I not have a heck of a lot of information on this neck of the woods, but Aaron helped me, and she introduced me to Dan, and Dan had a lot of information, and so I was able to fill in all those points. I don't see it here tonight, but Sean Duffy from the Ohio County Library also provided a lot of info. So personally, I want to thank you all. The other thing I'm going to do is take this off, because it's mighty long. And now as we go through this, if you have questions, I'll go ahead and answer them. But if we get too far behind, I may have to cut them off. So, anyways, the start here is about the Cleveland, Lorain, and wheeling. And definitely, we are part of it here in Bel Air. That was one of the things that was wanted by the Bel Air merchants, was to be able to get to the Lake Erie. They had the wheeling, they had the Central Ohio, and they had the Baltimore and Ohio. But they were east-west railroads. So when the CLNW came down here, they went ahead and said, hey, you're in Bridgeport. How about you guys come to 2 more miles south? And the CLNW said, yeah, that sounds good. That's what we'll do. So this here is a map. Okay, moving along. Oh, yeah, one of these days I'll learn to turn the switch on. Okay, well, anyways, this here was the Port of Cleveland and the Port of Lorain. And so this is the line that came on down. This is the line that came on down, ended at Bridgeport, and then was extended first south to Galera, and then later up to Martin's Ferry. And so, that being the case, why, this is what this presentation is all about. And the organization I belong to is Midwest Railroad Preservation Society. We're headquartered up in Cleveland in the old Baltimore and Ohio Railroad. So people say, well, what is Midwest Railroad Preservation Society? Well, it's a lot of words, so we kind of shut it down to either MRPS or Midwest. That's pretty much what we know. And who are we? Well, like you, we like railroads. And so the only difference may be is there's, I'm sure, some model railroads here, but we're the 4'8.5" or 56" gauge guys. And so that is basically, I think, the common point that we're all here today. But we also then got into some specialized things in Midwest. And as you can see here, that one of the big things was title was Preservation Society. Well, that's just what we did. This particular coach, as you can see, the roof being in the middle of repair, when we did that. This particular car got vandalized, and all the windows were broken, and all of the globes, with one exception, were broken. And we restored that car to what you see here. It currently is on lease to a scenic railroad down in Cincinnati. Okay, there's other things too. Diesel locomotive. What we did here is we fixed up a couple of diesels and we got them out on lease to customers. One was at a scrapyard, one was at a warehouse, a steel warehouse. And so that provides funds. But this is where we just ripped the whole thing apart and started with a new frame. And as you can see here, it's tack level and everything. And this is the fellow that was the lead on it. And here is with the completed cab. And basically, he did the same thing over on the hood of the locomotive. All right, and also we have steam. We have the 4070 steam locomotive. And that's just the run on what was called the Colorado Valley line. It was a steam railroad line between Cleveland and Akron. And what we're doing here is we are taking out what they call the superheater tubes. And we are taking them out and we are replacing some of the parts of them, particularly what they call the turns. There's 4 tubes there. There's actually 4 tubes, and you start at the one, you go through, you loop, you come back with the loop there, do another loop, you come out over here. And what that does is, besides the steam that is made in the boiler, the heat from the fire goes through hollow tubes, of which these are inserted, and they heat it up even more, hence the term superheater. And what it does, the more heat you can accumulate, the more power you can get out of that locomotive. All right, so that's what he's doing there. Here they're testing the superheater tubes, because after we put them together, the steam locomotive operates at 200 pounds per square inch pressure. We wanted to make sure that the tubes themselves now, after we repair, would hold that pressure. So we tested 2 things. Over here, we're rebuilding the firebox. And not the firebox, I'm sorry, the asphalt is part of the firebox. As you know, we have coals that are burning, and we have ashes when we're done. And so they would go into this hopper, And then this hopper, after the locomotive came in, we would dump that on the track, leave the engine off, and spray it down with water, and move the slush out. And over here, this is going to give you an idea how big the firebox is. These three guys are inside the firebox of that steam locomotive. And this guy here is standing. Now, this is base the bottom, but what he's doing at this point is getting measurements because he fabricated this particular box. All right, so that's another thing, and we are just in the process of the next week or so of welding a cracked frame on our steam locomotive. So that will take place. It's roughly an 18-hour job. Once you start it, you have to complete. You cannot stop and come back. Once you start that welding process, you must complete it. So things are being made just all set. And Lincoln Electric has helped us in that respect. They bring us the welding rods and the equipment, etc. They are willing to let do the welding because they didn't want the liability if something happened. Anyways, other things we did, historic structure preservation. As you can see here, this is the building that was the oldest depot, the oldest building in Baltimore, Ohio. It's a little building south of Bedford. Okay, and what we did there is we lifted the building up in jacks, we replaced any of the beams that were rotted, we built up the sidewalls, new foundation, and then this is after it was done. All right, besides that, we also take historic records, we take photographs, and we preserve them digitally whenever we can. All of this photographs and that are pretty much in the process of being digitized or have been. But we've got quite an extensive collection down at our headquarters, which is the Roundhouse, our Roundhouse in Cleveland. All right, and this is old, but it was the last issue that we did paper-wise. Now everything is electronic. And this is to keep everybody informed. We call it the marker lights. Marker lights are the lights at the back end of the train to let the oncoming trains know that, hey, we're here, don't run into us. And more importantly, that this is the end of the train, so as you would pass the station, the agent will look and say, oh yeah, okay, you didn't break a parts. Well, with the air brake systems they have nowadays, that was the problem. Back around the turn of the first turn of the century, 100 and some years ago, they had what they call link and pen. And if the link broke and the two-car train, or the car was separated from the train, you'd never know it. Because there was nothing that would break it automatically. So, anyways, that was the term that we adapted here, and that's marker lights. All right, now, another thing, community service. This is in the town of Bedford. Every Christmas they had what they call Christmas in Bedford Falls. I don't know where they got the falls, but that sounded pretty good, I guess. And what we would do, this is my railroad, and we would bring Santa, the caboose belonged to the Midwest, locomotive belonged to myself, and we would bring Santa in, and he would greet, as you can see here, all of the kids. And then after that, he's getting down over here off of the train car. All right, I must have pressed it off there. There we go. Okay. So right here, he's getting off. From there, he stepped on the fire engine and went down the parade. All right, education, Operation Lifesaver. You may have heard of this. This is a program for 3rd graders and 10th graders. And what they do is they get on board the train. We have a monitor at the very front, as you can see here. And that monitor is connected to a camera from the locomotive. So So whoever's in this car would be able to see what's going on with that locomotive. And then the thing we try to teach the third graders, because they're the ones who are old enough to get away from the family yard now. Stay away from the tracks. They're dangerous. They don't want you near the tracks. And you gotta watch out because there are people who don't listen and they're trespassing. And when you heard these kids, when you saw somebody in front of the train, they were walking the track. Oh, look at that man. Oh, he's not so. So they were evidently impressed. Now, the one that was for the 10th graders, because they were just basically starting to drive, was don't try and beat a train. Your automobile may weigh a ton. If you've got an older one, maybe 2 tons. But the locomotive alone is over 190 tons. And each car behind you is some 30 tons. So if you are trying to beat a train and the train hits you, who do you think's going to win? You or the train? And that kind of sticks with them somewhat. Okay. So we do a lot of other stuff besides. That gives you some idea of who we are. So now that the commercial's out of the way, let's get on with the program. So, and the traditional saying, all aboard. So to you, all aboard. Thank you for this particular case, the Cleveland, Lorain, and Wheeling Railroad. And these are the people that I want to thank. And among others, there's Dan, and there's Aaron, and there's Shelley, who I've not had the opportunity to meet, and Sean Duffy, among others here. And all of these have contributed in one way or another to putting this thing together. All right, starting off with a brief history. 1870 in Lorain, Ohio, this is one of the first of the organizations was formed. And this was the Lakeshore Tuscarawas Valley. A year later, the Lorain and Black River were organized. A year after that, they were combined. And then in 1875, they changed the name. And you'll notice it says Railway, because 2 years later, what did they do? They changed it again, but they now call it Railroad. This was a common practice back in those days, that rather than change the entire name, if they had railroad in it, they changed it to railway. If they had railway in it, they would change it to railroad. And that would satisfy the legal requirements. Okay, so anyways, 1877 it became the railroad, and they got a charter built, excuse me, from Yorksville. And with the old one, the railway, they made it down there to Yorksville. And now what they were doing was they were going from Yorksville right here to Bridgeport. And so what they did was 5 years, 6 years later, it was called the Cleveland, Lorain, and Wheeling at that point, and it came into Bridgeport in 1884. Now, in 1884, in 1886, the CLNW went ahead and revised their charter to come down to Bel Air, and then very shortly thereafter, they revised it again to go up to, good heavens, I'm losing the times, to go up to Martins Ferry. So, okay, so that was the history here. At the very end, where it shows 1901, Baltimore, Ohio wanted to get hold of Cleveland, Lorain, and Wheeling. And why did they want it? Well, as you see right here, that it was completed all the way up to the lake. Now, why would it be a road? Something that the railroad, I mean, they could go that way via Pittsburgh and then Akron, but they couldn't get to the lake. So what they did was they wanted to go up there in order to get access to Lake Erie and the Cleveland Market. So right here we're going to start now. We're going to go from the beginning, and you go down to a conversion point called Leicester, and you go back up to Lorain, and you come back to Leicester and continue on south all the way down here to Blair, and then across the river to Wheeling. So, right here is the topographic map, and not to worry too much, but this is West 3rd Street in Cleveland. This is the Baltimore and Ohio, present Baltimore and Ohio Railroad yard. And this here lead was where the CLNW had built the freight station and had this is the lead coming off there. They had, whoops. Oh my goodness. Aaron, how do I back this up?
You were backing it up.
That's what I thought. Oh, okay. All right, so anyways, we come off of the yard here. This was the lead that came down from the West 3rd Street station and went along Baltimore, Ohio, and continued on south. And this will give you again a maps view. Up here is where it started. This is West 3rd. This is where the freight and the passenger and a small engine house was, right up here. And it came down, as you saw out there, followed the Baltimore, Ohio, and came down to this point here, where it crossed the Baltimore, Ohio, and I'll show you how it was controlled, and then continued on past the Cleveland Zoo, as you can see here, Cleveland Lorain and Wheeling, and it now headed on its way towards Lorain. All right, at a railroad crossing, you have to have some kind of control. So the two trains don't try and outrace each other. The first one to get over, the other one runs into them. And that was called a tower. In this case, it happens to be the RD tower. I have no idea what RD stood for, but there it was. Each one had a name. And this here signal that you see, right here, was what controlled. This here was the track that went up with the nickel plate. This is the Baltimore, Ohio, and off of it, starting here, was a switch, and the track crossed there. This signal controlled everything. When it was in the horizontal position, as you see it, that said only a Baltimore and Ohio train could proceed. All others had to stop. And then when it was raised to a vertical position, that meant that the Baltimore, Ohio train had to stop, and the nickel plate could go through, or the CLNW could go through. All right, how is this controlled? Well, inside this tower was the control board. Now, you'll notice that there's lights here. On this one, this is the nickel plate, and this is the CLNW, but there's no lights on this one. That's Baltimore, Ohio. The reason he didn't need lights, this guy worked for the Baltimore, Ohio. He knew what trains were coming at what time. He had a telephone connection with the dispatcher, so he didn't have to worry. But he did know if the nickel plate train was coming, or if one of the CLNWs were coming and going. So that was his status for him. And how he controlled the signal was with this lever. That was his basic job, was to know what trains are coming and move that signal arm accordingly, the horizontal or vertical. Not a bad job. The rest of the time, what did you do? Read a magazine. So, right here, we just happen to show this is our steam locomotive, and it was coming across, and it's on a B&O track, so that's horizontal. It says he's good, but nickel plate, CLNW, you can't. Okay, so moving along from there, now we're going under the West 25th Street Bridge, or the Pearl Road Bridge. And this is back into place, and this was the Brooklyn Station. Further down the line, you went into Parma, and Parma, right where this freight station is, used to have a depot for passengers at one time. But in recent years, the only reason they kept this particular depot is that behind it is the Chevrolet plant, and they used to take in and out, parts in, parts out from the Chevrolet plant. It was an engine plant. They went ahead and produced the engines for the Chevrolet vehicles. All right, now we go further south, we come to Berea. The Berea depot was about 5 miles out of town, but it also had another purpose, and that purpose was to control the switch that went to the stone quarries in Berea. Berea had a very, quality kind of sandstone, and it was used in manufacturing, particularly with roads to grind grain, what have you. So that was over here, and this map doesn't want to show it, but this line that you see here, this is the railroad. Let's go up here to the New York Central, which this one here is then extended over to the depot that you just saw a moment ago, the Lorain, West Virginia depot. All right, this is a picture of the quarry as it looked when they first opened in the 1870s. And this is a more recent one, and you can see, if the quarry owned the property up to the building line, right there, that's just exactly how much stone we took out. So, okay, now, this is interesting. This is the Parkway. This is south of Berea, on its way to Strongsville. And you'll notice that you've got a steel girder here for the bridge. But they also have fill, third fill, and the track is only third fill. But what you don't see is this. That's what they covered with dirt. They built a bridge, or a trestle as this is called, and that trestle then allowed them to get the trains moving, and then during the time when there was no scheduled trains, more train would come in and dump dirt. As you saw in that previous picture, until it was totally covered. Now, to this day, if you look close, you can see those trestle vents. Trestle vent being the wooden part of the trestle. And it's right here. See, there's the vertical, there's the other vertical, another vertical, and there's the braces. So you still can see part of that whole trestle. Really can drive up to the Okay, well, anyways, next stop was, excuse me, here at Strongsville. Now, this also had a name, it was called Vigil, as you might know. And the name Vigil came about because you had to be vigilant. The reason you had to be vigilant is you had this main track here, but you also have this track, and this was an interurban streetcar, high speed. It looked like a streetcar, it was an interurban car, it was electric. And over here was the main highway, Prospect Road, and this was westward that went into downtown Strongsville. So between the railroad, the cars, and of course the interurban, the town at one time was called Vigil, and now it's just part of Strongsville. Here's another picture of the depot. This is now looking south, going down towards Valley City. And here is a close-up of the depot. And you notice I put it also known as Vigil. Okay, there is a picture of the interurban streetcar. Notice those streetcars, if you want to call them that, travel on the average 50 miles an hour. They were much quicker and were actually in competition to the steam railroads of the day. They were in their glory up to about 1920 when the automobiles took over and passenger service started to decline, and even that was basically their entire business. Yeah, they did have some freights, motors, but it was mostly passengers, so they went out of business by the time 1930 went out. And that's primarily due to the automobile. And then like the railway Lake Erie, 8 years later, they went out of the passenger business too. And sometime in the early 50s, so did the Baltimore and Ohio. So at least down here. Okay, well anyways, now we're going further south, and this is the Valley City Depot. It's in Liverpool Township, and the town was right here. It was back around the turn of that century. It was a pretty bustling town. All right, so from here now we're going to go further south. Oops, almost forgot. This is, I took my son, Ed's going to take his son. I took my son out here, and because they were talking about tearing this down. Well, they didn't actually tear it down and move it into the city of Valley City, and it became the headquarters for the Chamber of Commerce. So the depot still survives, but not there. All right, now we go to Leicester. Leicester is a conversion point. So, in Leicester, you have basically a Y. And the left leg of the Y went off, as you can see, the Lorain. Then you had the depot itself, the main portion where the ticket offices were. And then you had the other side that went to Cleveland. And here are some of the older pictures. That was back in the heyday of the 50s, with steam locomotives, with trains and everything. And same way here on the Lorain side. So this was a fairly busy convergence point. Now what we're going to do at this point is we're going to go up to Lorain. And the other station that we have here is at Grafton. And Grafton had a tower, an interlocking tower.
Have you heard anything about CSX offering that Leicester Depot for sale?
No, I haven't.
I guess they want to get rid of it, and there's talk that they're offering it to Medina County Parks. That's $140,000 to move it.
That's probably what the guy just said. Thanks for those things. We got a couple of depots. No, I had not heard of that, Bob. Okay, well, anyways, this depot here is the freight house. And it's still standing. And as you can see here, this lead that goes off to the left connected with the Big Four Railroad, and that was how they interchanged cars between Lorain and Lorain and the Big Four and Craft. All right, from there, we move on to Lorain itself, and this was the Union Depot. A Union Depot meant it was built for two railroads that happened to converge or cross, and one of the railroads would own the depot and the other would pay rent. And it was operated for both railroads. So this is the one here, the Baltimore, Ohio, and the Became. So when I say Baltimore, Ohio, it was really built for the time of the CLW. This was the roundhouse there at Lorain, and you can see it has not been used in many years. I took this picture from West, Dan West, who was the owner of that website. And by the way, in the bottom of all of these photographs, I give credit. Now, West 2K is the West website, and Dan West is the owner of that website. So if you go online and you look up West 2K, you're going to find he has got, like every county, he's got two sections. He's got existing railroad pictures of depots, yards, and what have you. He's primarily depots and yards. And he also has the older ones. And you can just click on some of the older ones and you have the photograph of that. So I have a number of there. This happened to be one. All right, now, this is where the B&O wanted to get the CO done. And that ultimately did, as you of course know. Because this was the coal unloading and they would bring the train cars of coal, and would put them in basically a continental barrel that would rotate and dump the coal out of it until it would shoot into the hole of the ships. This one here was the other way around. They would unload, these were helium loaders, and they would unload iron ore and put it in cars, and then they were able to take that up in the clearance of the mills and take them down here to a layer across the loop, go up to Pittsburgh. And so that was another reason that we wanted, B&O wanted to get the CLW. Okay, so at this point, we're going back to Lester. We're going to work our way on down here. So next one is Medina. Medina had a freight and passenger station opposite each other. This is, of course, passenger, and this is freight. It's still standing, and it got some pictures of it. There's also a picture, they moved this Medina depot, as you see here, over to this spot on Marks Road. It's nearby, and some group was saving it. So that is still there, I understand. Haven't looked recently, but it's going to Google Earth, you can probably see just about all of these. All right, this is the freight building which we saw earlier, and this is still standing, and it's on the original right-of-way. The right-of-way that you have now of the Baltimore, Ohio, didn't go through this town of Medina, it went around it. So this here is the original right-of-way of the CLW. And this is inside. This is the office as it looked about 30-some years ago, 40 years ago. A little messy, but then again, people went in there and looking and tore stuff apart, looking for whatever they were looking for. So that's one way. That's the door out to the street. This is how looking the opposite way, and the washroom, and then that door that you see over here is going into the freight house, which looks like this. And once again, there's no freight because they haven't used it. Nobody has not used it. Okay, now we go a little further south, and this is Seville. That's a CLW train going north, and there's probably a Kole right behind it. And over here is how the depot looked in 1920. And unfortunately, this is how it looked now. Actually, it looked 30 years ago. All right, so from Seville now, we go down to a crossing of the main line. This is the B&O line, right here. And that went from Lorain to Akron and beyond. And over here was the depot, and this is the CLW's track. Now, you can see the signals that control this movement. And what controlled the signal? Well, as you can see here, because it did cross the main line, it needed some signal control, and that was this tower right here. And this is a picture of it. It's in 1989. Now you notice that the track, CLW, no longer goes across it, as you can see here, it used to. And that's because what happened by the time I took that photograph was that track was being ripped up. And it started all the way, well, actually, it was ripped up from Marcus Ferry on the road. So at this point, then, like I say, that was the tower. I think it's gone now. I haven't looked recently, but it was rather dilapidated. And they had already started to put in these signals here, automatic signals. There's toolbox and signals. So, and then you can just see that when you're the opposite. So this thing was kind of in its dying days, if you will. All right, so we move from there, we go to Easton. And this depot evidently had just been built. The reason I say that is it's pretty new, but notice this hole in the roof? There's no semaphore here to control telling the train whether to stop or not. But if you look at this later photograph, there it is. So these here are probably passengers waiting right behind the locomotive, and then the passenger car. All right, excuse me, we move further south now. We're going down to Warwick first, and then Canal Fort. Warwick, again, this looks like a new station. It was very Union Depot with the Pennsylvania Railroad. But if you look here closely, these look like workmen, and right there's a sign that says paint, and it's blocking the stairs, so they must have just freshly painted that. So I'm making an assumption that this is a pretty brand new depot. There wasn't a workman that lined up for the photographer. All right, so now we go down to Canal Fort. And Canal Fort was a fairly large town for the day. It's still there. It's another canal town besides, and hence the name Canal Fort. And in the flood, back in 1913, there was a tremendous flood in Ohio. I'm not going to get into it, but it did wipe out a lot of bridges, towns, railways, etc., roadways. And this happened to be, somebody took a picture of that station. But you can see that there's no water-wise. So the track and the station survived. All right, so now we go from Canal Fort, we're working our way down to Massillon. And at Massillon, a station, when this picture was taken, was the Blue Station. The Baltimore and Ohio Railroad, by 1905, owned the CLNW. And because of that, we started to replace the old depots with these Brooklyns and the towns that they deemed were worthy of going to a big depot. All right, leaving Massillon, we head on down. Right here, we head on down, we'll go through Justice, and we're going down to Beach City. And a couple of pictures there, Depot being, of course, on the left here. And the town is right around here, and most of it is on that end. This is kind of a creek. And there's another picture of the same depot. And the building next to it is not a freight house, this is a combination depot. So that's probably some kind of an industry or a warehouse there. All right, so now we're going down to Strasburg. We're getting closer and closer to Lorain. And we, Strasburg here, we've got a couple of pictures. And this is interesting. This particular picture has this device from stepladder. And what is it? As you can see in this next picture, they would attach a bag of mail to that device. And a train would come by and throw out a mail bag on the ground. Station agent would get it after the train left. And this, as the car would by, it would snag this. And that's how they transfer mail without having to slow down the train. So that is at Strasburg. Now we go from Strasburg down to Canal Dover. Now it's just called Dover. But at that time, the Ohio River Canal came through there. So in Dover, we had a fairly large yard, and right at this spot was the freight depot. And it's no longer there, and probably was not much longer after the picture was taken in 1990. But this is the depot, not the world's biggest. But this time it was still owned by CSX, or Chesapeake. And there's another view. Now this is looking to the south. So to your right is going down towards the river. And to the left, or towards you, the bottom left of the photograph, is heading north towards Cleveland. And then in later years, R.G. Coleman took over this line. And that's pretty much where it ended before Holloway and all that was worked out. So Coleman operated this line north, and to the south and just sort of die the natural death. This is down in New Philadelphia, and if you look in there, there's another of the original, of the new Baltimore and Ohio depots. And on this one here, that's a picture of the same depot. And over here appears to be the original CONW depot. Okay, so we're now going to New Philadelphia down to Yorksville. And what's interesting is town of Midvale. If you look at this next picture, you're going to think, what the heck, that's a house. And that's what I thought when I first found it. And it's not a house. Really. And the giveaway is, this is the bump out, if you will, that the agent could sit to look down and look the track. And here's the train approaching right here. And so this particular house is actually a depot. All right, from there we leave Midvale, we head on down to Yorksville, and another Union depot. The CLNW track is the single track, and this double track here is Pennsylvania Railroad. All right, so it leaves Yorksville going down to Stillwater, which is down here. And you can see that all of these now are following pretty much rivers and streams. And the reason being is you got a lot of hills all around here, and that's almost impossible to build a railroad because you're going to have to make all kinds of cuts, fills, and tunnels. So by following the stream, that was the easiest way. And at Stillwater, we're going down now to Tipping Canoe. And here at Tipping Canoe is another one of the CLNW depots. Another picture of it, the time of the train. And again, circa 1915, when we were about just looking at the drifts of carriage and kind of thinking of the All right, now we're going down to Freeport. And this is the depot of Freeport, and here is another picture of it. And again, right around the turn of the century from the dress. And now we're going to Piedmont. Piedmont being down here in the, and again, you notice follow the creek. All right, and just there's a cut here. This is a ridge, and there's no cut, you just cut it. And we follow the creek. All right, we got down to Piedmont, there's the depot. And interesting, there is some kind of a factory here, right here. And evidently they make wood products. These look like railroad ties. These might be fence posts. I don't know what these are. But it had the name of the factory right here. You can just make out the words T-O-R-Y. I couldn't get that. So anyways, one thing, this was the Piedmont Depot. I had a train there.
Mike, that was a handle factory. They made all kinds of wooden handles there.
That's what they made.
And
Okay.
I don't know whether it was owned by the B&O or whether the B&O bought a lot of their handles.
They probably bought, because, there, like I say, there's railroad ties right there. Okay, well, thank you, Ed, Bob, and now moving on down, we're going to Flushing, but we're going to stop at Holloway. Holloway was important because that's where all the small portions out of West Virginia came, and we made it to longer trains going up to Lorain or Cleveland. So, here is the depot, and you can see it's one of those 1905 rebuilds that the B&O did. And as you come into a yard, this is Holloway Yard, before the days of the radio, the conductor would get on this telephone that was in this concrete booth here, and he would call the yard master to get permission to enter the yard, and also what tracks to put his train on, if he was going to drop cars. This is a picture of the yard office, right here, and some of the tracks. The main line was on the other side of these cars. It's all gone now. That was the yard where they got the small coal trains, and they made up the big ones that go further north. All right, Flushing. Now, at Flushing, this is the second depot. The first one burned out, but this was also a CLW depot, and you can see the tunnel in the background, right there. And that tunnel still exists, but the rails are gone now. But back then, I was able to get a picture of it, and still on through and across the depot and stuff. So now we're going to Bannock, and we leave Flushing, and now we're starting to follow Wheeling Creek. And we all know where Wheeling Creek is going to end up. So here is Bannock, and what you have here is the new depot, the CLW new depot. This was the old CLW depot, and the old one was right alongside the creek. That's the old depot. There's new. So when they say 1884, that was the CLW depot. And this was the new one, and probably from the looks of it was also a CLW depot. I don't know that for a fact. All right, so now we're going to Barton via Fairport and Beaver. So at Fairport, it was originally called Fair Point. That was back in the 1884 period. And for some reason it got changed. I don't know, never was able to find out. And it was, the original name was Fairport, and now it's Fairport. And we're thinking it was the Fairport Harbor up in the Cleveland area, just east of Cleveland. And that could have been the reason that this was changed to, from, excuse me, Fairport to Fairport. All right, Maynard, that red arrow points to the depot, and you can just barely see it here. That's it right there. The arrow, of course, pointing to it. And then as we move down to Barton, there's the depot. Again, the original CLW depot. And now, just south of Barton, you cut through a tunnel. There was a bridge. Rather than make a big roundabout and go through the tunnel, which is only about 300 feet long, it's flat. But as you can see here, it's comparatively short, and at one time it evidently was double tracked, because it looks like those tires on the right did have rails on them. Excuse me, at one time. All right, so from Barton, which is up here, this is where it cuts through that tunnel, right there. And it goes on down to Bridgeport, following Wheeling Creek. And as you can see here, there is Bridgeport. Oops, and this is where the train, this is Wheeling Creek. And this here is the symbol for the train route. And this is where it came in. And then ultimately went on down to Bridgeport. Side of Pennsylvania Highway. So this here was what they call the Sanborn Fire Insurance Act. Around the turn of the century, the Sanborn Insurance Company made maps of all the properties of the cities they insured. So this is where it comes in. As you can see, this is now Lincoln Street. Depot is here on Howard Street. So we'll get a better picture. This here is from the Ohio or Central Ohio County Library. And this is the bridge over the Ohio River. And that was the way that originally the CLW said, we've reached Wheeling. Well, we almost reached Wheeling. We had to go across the bridge. And then across the second bridge to get to the Wheeling itself. All right, the depot is right here is the track, and you can hardly see it, but right here, this is Howard Street. And right here behind this building, this little bit here, that is the depot. This next one kind of shows it, and the wording is upside down because I try and keep the same orientation. In this case, north is to the top, south is to the bottom. So, as you can see here, this was the track that came, this is the CLNW, and right here, the other points to the depot. This building in that photograph is obscuring most of the depot. And right there, it does say passenger, CLNW passenger. Okay, now that was the Sanborn map, and that was taken in 1884. All right, the second depot was right there by the approach to the bridge, and I think that's US 40 nowadays. But that is where the second depot was. This is the Pennsylvania Railroad depot at the time. And the old one is out of the picture when it came down like this. Okay, this is the roundhouse that was there, again from the Sanborn fire insurance maps. And you can see some of them are out there with these tracks right here, and the roundhouse. And then on this next one, you can see they expanded quite a bit. The roundhouse, and the leads getting into it, as well as the yard tracks. They added 3 more of them. And again, this is Sanborn map 1903. This here was a timetable, and we first started service on November 16th of 1884. And so this was in a newspaper that had been scanned by the government, and in turn allowed me to excise a section of it, which was the timetable. And you can see that, as it says here, leaves Bridgeport, and it goes right on out to Barton, Maynard, Fairpoint, etc., coming on up and ending up there in Cleveland. And then vice versa. Now they're saying this is the route in the other direction, leaving Cleveland and looking its own down to Bridgeport. Okay, so basically at that point they said, we've done it, we've made it. Well, this is where now the people here in Baltimore, merchants, wanted to get up to the markets in Cleveland and Lorain and along the way. And so they asked, and the railroad agreed, to seal it, that we need to extend along down south to Lorain or up north to Moses Ferry. So, 1886, it came down here. The following year, it was again amended and went up to Moses Ferry. And this here is just a map of Bridgeport, comes on down, this is Lorain, and the tracks come in to the station. There's a little better map going up north. And right here, this is the CLNW, the stubble line is the Pennsylvania Railroad, and it came in here. And this is the dam providing the picture. And this is a picture of the Laird Depot, CLNW Depot. And the statement said the State Guard, probably the National Guard, was called that back then, were going to St. Clairsville on a train. So I probably would have went there. I would see Central and Ohio.
It would be going north to up to Barton, and then there was a line that went up to St. Clairsville.
All right, thank you. All right, so this here, I'm just going to say that it did interchange, CLNW interchange with the Central Ohio, and that will give you much particular detail and more information on that. But this was the yard, that's the viaduct that still stands, and this is where the yard was, and the photograph over there, I think it's it shows roundhouse here. roundhouse, but I'm saying is part of the reason Central Ohio is where they built this area. Again, just as an FYI at this point, I'm going to tell you all about that. And there is the first bridge over the Ohio River. It was built in 1871. And the deal is looking from Benwood across to Lorain. And this is the approach. That area there is to the west, and behind us this way is going towards the bridge. And if you turn around and standing there, as I took a picture, you can see now the approach going up towards the bridge. Now this here was built by the B&O, and we'll get into that in a moment. But here's where the two of them came together. It's called Lorain Junction. It said here, this is 1898, they built this large approach to the Ohio River Bridge. The question is, well, why would the B&O want to do that? Well, it says here, Kole. Remember the show that was Kole and loading docks up there? That was where they wanted to get. So rather than have to do all kinds of switching back, that north approach was built. The line just came off the bridge, the town there, and connected with the CLMW, which ultimately became owned by the B&O. And as they said here, trackage rights. Yeah, they are not rights, but trackage through a lot of the coal fields in West Virginia. And as a result, coal owners would like to see their coal get up there to the lake, because now this is expanding up. They can go out to the Atlantic Ocean. They can go anywhere along the Great Lakes and stay up to coal in the resort of all these roads. So, there is the reason, right there. It's simple. That, by the way, is a $5,000 bill. I didn't know they existed. So I happened to find that one. Not the real thing. Okay, so this is the north approach. This is the one where I already drove many trains over it, going into Benwood for what they call the bridge track.
Is that double track or what is that?
This right here,
Yeah, it's like track inside a track.
this here is a safety track.
Okay.
If a car derailed, it would get caught between the two, and it would go off to the side and maybe pull some of the other cars off the road. All bridges have that kind of an approach with that safety level. All right. So, what happened in 1901? CLW stock was being bought by the B&O, and they did, and then ultimately they made it a subsidiary. So, Cleveland Railroad building in 1908 became Baltimore and Ohio. This was the new bridge that was built in 1905. It's out there today. This is the depot in Delaware. This picture, which is on the wall here somewhere inside, is the actual depot was on Union Street at 31st. And here's another picture of it going up. This street was right here. You went inside, you went up this little stairway onto that platform. And this is where the passengers would get on and off the train. All right. Later on, the depot was taken out of service, and this here tower, J Tower, was used as a passenger depot, taken into passenger service. And this is how it looked back in the 90s when I was ready to train that way. And of course, all in all, we're going over the bridge, coming to Benwood, and that's looking back towards Delaware. And this is the Benwood Depot. And what it went from there was it sort of did a big loop back in the day. When I had it, we just go over the Benwood Yard. But the passenger trains now would turn around and follow the river and go into downtown Wheeler. And in Wheeler, this is the passenger station, and it had this commemorative here in 1852. All right? This is the depot in Wheeling with the platform on it in 1961. And then as time went on, the depot platform was removed, the tracks were taken out. The building itself still said Baltimore and Ohio Railroad, and these windows, the center ones, were actually doors for that platform. And this is the passenger entrance, which is the other side of the building. And this is the front door entrance, and there's an interesting logo there. And that one basically says B, and there's the and sign, and O, from coast to Baltimore and Ohio. We put that people. And with that, I kind of come to the end, and this book says, that's all. Okay. If there's any last questions, I'll be glad to answer them, and we'll turn it over to Lorain.
Any questions? Okay. I'll introduce.
Okay. Thank you, Michael. That's very interesting. Next up, we have Daniel Frizzi presenting on the Central Ohio Railway. Dan Frizzi is a practicing attorney, is a member of the Bel-Air Public Library Board of Trustees and the Board of Trustees of the Great Stone Viaduct Historical Education Society, who we partner with every winter for the Winter Lecture Series. If you're interested in local history, those programs run every Wednesday at 6 p.m. throughout February and March, so that mark that in your calendar. We'll have a schedule of events that will be up by December or January. Dan is the author of several local history books, including People, Places, and Pulteney, a history of the development of railroads in Pulteney Township of Bel-Air County, Ohio, and in particular the city of Bel-Air. That might be the most likely title in our collections upstairs. But we do have copies of available to check out. We are part of a statewide system, so even if you don't have a library card here, you can get that through the catalog and it will be sent to your library. Dan is also a railroad photographer and has graciously donated his collection of photographs to our new local history center. Mark your calendars also for Friday, October 3rd. That will be the grand opening of our local history center. In the meantime, you can browse Dan's collections. We have them out here on the table, on this table here, as well as the Frank Curtis Railroad collection on the back table there that contains numerous black and white photographs of the narrow gauge railroad chartered as the Bel-Air and Southwestern Railroad in 1875, later named the Bel-Air Zanesville and Cincinnati Railroad in the 1880s, and finally the Ohio River and Western Railroad after 1900, when it was absorbed by the Pennsylvania Railroad system. So feel free to browse these photograph collections from our local history center upstairs after the end of the lecture. But for now, everybody please welcome Dan Frizzi.
Am I coming through okay, or is this going to be up high?
I think it needs to be up higher. Is it turned on? It was turned off. Yeah.
How's that?
Oh, much better.
I'm sorry. Hear myself. Okay, well, I haven't been married as long as Michael. I've been married 50 years this year. He's been married 56. I also have a pilot's license, but it is a VFR pilot. I don't have the instrument rating. And although I have never operated a locomotive, I do have with me today a gentleman who has been a long-time engineer for the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad, and I had the privilege of riding with Jess Austin was from Martins Ferry. It was on the Martins Ferry local from Martins Ferry to Benwood and back. Okay, I have photographs of that that are in my collection. And the second time I had the privilege of riding on a locomotive with Jess was down on the Potomac Eagle. And both Dave Sly and I rode in the cab with Jess, and we got some great photos. Dave videoed the entire trip. I actually got some photos of a few eagles while we were there on that trip. Jess, I'm really glad to see that you were able to make this today. Jess is from Baltimore, Ohio, and worked for the Baltimore and Ohio and then later for CSX. How many years? 42 years? 42 years with the railroad. Okay, well, my presentation today is going to kind of follow the book that I wrote in 2003 for the Ohio State Bicentennial. That was about a man named Sullivan. A man named Sullivan who actually came to live here in Bel Air when he was the president of the Central Ohio Railroad. So it's going to follow along that storyline of the man named Sullivan, who was Colonel John Hand Sullivan. The Tidewater Connection. Tidewater Connection. Baltimore and Ohio reached Wheeling in 1852 on Christmas Eve. They drove the final spikes down on Grave Creek, just outside of Moundsville, West Virginia, and it connected the Ohio River, Ohio, Baltimore, and Ohio. That was the goal, to reach the Ohio, and the tidewater of the Chesapeake Bay, Baltimore. The track closing occurs at a place in just outside of Moundsville that we know as Rosebee's Rock. How many people have been to Rosebee's Rock? You've been past it, right? Yes. Rosebee's Rock, I guess I could liken it best to going to Gettysburg. I didn't get the opportunity to view Rosebee's Rock while trains were actually passing. But this is the place where the last spike was driven on Christmas Eve in 1852. And there's some question about when that huge rock was engraved. But the reason that that rock was engraved as Rosebee's Rock was because they spelled the name wrong. But Roseby Carr was the track foreman who was in charge of the track gang that drove that spike that connected the railroad from Baltimore with the Ohio River at Wheeling. And so when, in 1852, the B&O had actually reached Wheeling, there was a tremendous effort being made to complete another railroad that was being built in Ohio. And that railroad was the Central Ohio Railroad. And at the time that the Baltimore and Ohio had reached Wheeling in 1852, the Central Ohio Railroad was at that time just completed between Zanesville and Newark, Ohio. That's all the farther that the rails had extended. The Mystic Train. These are not my words. The Mystic Train were words that were used by Colonel Sullivan, the man that we're going to be talking about here in a bit. What did he mean by the Mystic Train? The Mystic Train, back in the 1850s, people in Ohio had really not had the opportunity to even see what a locomotive looked like. It was something that was likened by Colonel Sullivan to a chimera, a mythical chimera. It was something that looks like, that's what a chimera is right here. Okay, it's got the head of a dragon, head of a lion. It's kind of mythical. Do they really believe that there is such a thing as a steam locomotive? People who have never seen one had a hard time even envisioning what one would look like, let alone being willing to invest their dollars in something that they had not seen. And so when Colonel Sullivan, who was present at the banquet held in Wheeling, West Virginia, on the completion of the Baltimore and Ohio to Wheeling, he stood up and he spoke these words: "Here at last, afar from its starting place at the tidewater, sweeps the mystic train into this fair valley of the West." And with those words, the crowd erupted in applause. At the time, Colonel Sullivan was the president and in charge of directing the work on the completion of the Central Ohio Railroad. Now, the Central Ohio Railroad, it was chartered in 1857. It wasn't the first railroad in Ohio, okay? But it was one that was probably the most important in that it was chartered to connect the state capital in Columbus with the Ohio River. It was chartered in 1847, and its directors were given the right to complete the track from the state capital and to strike the Ohio River at any point they chose. But it must pass through Newark and Zanesville. That was the only requirement that the charter called for. It had to begin in Columbus. It had to end at the Ohio River. Legislation said, we're not really going to tell you where to strike the Ohio River, but you have to complete this railroad through both Newark and Zanesville. The Central Ohio was underfunded, it was heavily indebted, and it found it difficult to encourage people, taxpayers, to invest their money in a railroad. Because after all, the train was mystic, it was mythical. We haven't seen it, we don't know what it's going to do. So there was an effort made to raise funds by going to governments. Newark, Zanesville, they were asked to invest funds in building the railroad. What you see here is a stock certificate that I have as part of my collection. And here you see the signature of the president of that railroad, J.H. Sullivan. That's the man who the book is about. This is Colonel John H. Sullivan. He was not the first president of the Central Ohio Railroad. He was the second. The first president, who is not pictured there, was Solomon Sturgis. Now, he was a very wealthy businessman of Zanesville. He was elected to be the first president. But the railroad had trouble. It was having a difficult time finding investors, people who were willing to invest their money by buying stock, purchasing stock to build the railroad. And it wasn't until 1848 when Colonel Sullivan was named as the second president of the railroad in September of 1848 that the railroad actually began to acquire the funds that would be needed to build the railroad. His plan was to establish a terminus 4 miles below Wheeling at a new town, which he projected to call Bel Air. Well, it was already called Bel Air, but it was at that location where he intended it to become a city of Bel Air. In fact, when the town was originally incorporated after the railroad arrived, they had big plans. It wasn't just Bel Air, it was Bel Air City. So they projected that it was going to become much more than just a little bird called Bel Air. Sullivan was born in St. Clairsville, Ohio in 1808. His parents moved the family to Zanesville, Ohio when the state capital was moved from Chillicothe to Zanesville, Ohio. He was raised in a very prominent family. He married a girl that was originally from Wheeling named Susan Zane. Susan Zane of that famous Wheeling family. And then, after they they were married, he and Susan moved to the Iowa Territory. He developed a town out in Iowa, near Davenport, Iowa. He was involved in politics in the territory when there was a struggle to find the county seat for the county where he was residing. Ultimately, Davenport became the county seat of the county. But misfortune fell upon the young family. They had 3 small children, and Susan Zane fell ill, and it was necessary for the family to return in 1844 to Zanesville. She died soon after arriving back in Zanesville, and John then began his work as becoming the 2nd president of the fledgling railroad company. There were forces who did not like the idea of the railroad being terminated at this little podunk town 4 miles below Wheeling on the Ohio side called Bel Air. And it wasn't called Bel Air as we know today, it was Belair. That was what it was. That was the name that was given by the man that first settled here in 1802, named Jacob Davis. But there were other reasons, other problems that were related to Wheeling. And the first was that Wheeling lay opposite a large island which blocked direct access from Ohio into Virginia. A ferry would have to circumnavigate the island from Bridgeport, and then ultimate bridging of the Ohio River would have been made virtually impossible at that time, the 1800s, for 2 bridges, because if they did, they would have to cross the island. 1 bridge to cross to the island, and a 2nd bridge to cross over the main channel of the Ohio River. These geographic impediments favored a connection at Bel Air and Benwood. And that's the reason why Sullivan wanted the railroad to terminate here and not at Bridgeport. I know, Michael, you say that the namesake Cleveland, Lorain, and Wheeling, but unfortunately, CL&W never made it to Wheeling. The furthest they made it to was here at Bel Air. It was only because of the Central Ohio Railroad and the connection that was here and the ultimate bridging of the Ohio that the CL&W was actually able to get to Wheeling. This is an example, perhaps best explains why geography alone was going to make it so difficult for there to be a bridging directly into Wheeling. If you look here, you have this back channel, and here is where the railroad would have been. This is Wheeling Creek, and it came in along the south side of Wheeling Creek and then turned south. But you would have had to have had a bridge here, you would have to have had a bridge here, and then behind you is huge Wheeling Hill. Let's take as an example the problem of the Wheeling Lake Erie Railroad. In order to get into Wheeling, the Wheeling Lake Erie crossed the Ohio River at Martin's Ferry, and then had to immediately go into a mountain on the other side, into a tunnel. It had to go through the tunnel. Then it had to go into a 2nd tunnel just to get to Wheeling Creek. And then through the back door, it was able to follow Wheeling Creek to get into downtown Wheeling. Very, very difficult. Okay? Sullivan and the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad, principally its president, knew that this was going to be a tremendous geographic impediment to being able to bring the railroad directly into Wheeling. And this, unfortunately, was what the politicians and the investors in Wheeling expected. That's what they wanted the railroad to do. So when it became clear that there was not going to be a connection at Wheeling, Sullivan and other investors came to Bel Air and they acquired 131 acres that would encompass the entire Harris farm. Now, those of you who are familiar with Bel Air will know where the park is located in the middle of town. The Harris farm stretched from the middle of that park all the way down to McMahon Creek. Okay? We're right about in the middle of what would be the Harris farm. 131 acres, and it stretched all the way from the park down to McMahon Creek. This is what was purchased for $16,500. $16,500. Of course, that's back in the 1850s. The Central Ohio Railroad Company received land for the operation of the railroad and approaches to the Ohio River. That's what the railroad got out of this purchase. The company could sell land for a new city of Bel Air and use the proceeds to reduce the mortgage debt, because the railroad, the Central Ohio Railroad fronted the money to put a down payment on the $16,440, and then there was a mortgage that was given by Sullivan, Wright, and one other individual who was an investor. They gave a mortgage back to Mr. Harris. Okay, and then that ultimately would have to be paid, and the railroad company decided that the best way to reduce that debt was to sell land for the new city. The purchase immediately raised concerns in Zanesville and in Wheeling. Wheeling, because they realized immediately that when 131 acres of land was purchased by the president of the Central Ohio Railroad and two of his fellow investors here in Bel Air, that's where the railroad was going to terminate. It wasn't going to terminate in Zanesville immediately became concerned because they wanted the commerce and the business that was likely to occur to be centered in Zanesville, halfway between Columbus and the Ohio River. We'll see in a minute what some of those concerns were.
What year was this?
This would have been in about 1854. The railroad ultimately arrived in Bel Air in 1854. Okay, the folks in Wheeling suspected collusion between the Central Ohio Railroad and the B&O because they didn't want to cross in Wheeling. Wheeling folks were correct. There was collusion. There was collusion. And this is the reason why the folks in Wheeling were angry, because they had invested a great deal of money in the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad. And they had invested money in the Central Ohio Railroad, believing that that's where the terminus was going to be in Wheeling. But they immediately withdrew their stock subscriptions when they became aware that the projected terminus of the road was going to be here in Bel Air, 4 miles below Wheeling. And they also grew angry when they learned that there was going to be a steam ferry agreement between the Baltimore and Ohio and the Central Ohio, that they would exchange freight and passengers via a ferry service that would be between Bel Air and Benwood. There was a general distrust of the B&O Railroad to insist that the Central Ohio terminated in Wheeling, and they were correct. The B&O did not want to come to Wheeling and terminate here, and it was by and large geographical. But there was one other thing that happened. There was one other thing that happened that caused them not to want to go to Wheeling. Anybody know what it is? Aaron, I'm sure you know. What happened at Wheeling? A big windstorm. What happened in that windstorm? It knocked down the first Wheeling suspension bridge. It brought down the very first Wheeling suspension bridge. And when that happened, everybody who was in favor of keeping the terminus in Bellers at Sea, Wheeling, if that bridge came down, we're not going to go to Wheeling and build a bridge there. So all of these things caused concern for Wheeling, and that's why the bridge that is outside today actually is here in Bel Air, not in Wheeling. Okay, so where did the first steam locomotive for the Central Ohio Railroad come from? The first steam locomotive was called the Pataskala. The Pataskala. Okay? Pataskala is an Indian word meaning licking. And the Licking River is what flows into Zanesville from Newark. Now the photograph that you have, the image that you have here, it's not a photo of the Pataskala steam locomotive, but that is the engraving that appears on the Central Ohio stock certificates that were issued, and also the municipal bonds that were issued for the Central Ohio Railroad. The engine was loaded at Cleveland on a flatboat commanded by Captain Henry Harrier, commanded by Henry Harrier, and then Captain Quigley got on board, and he says through the history of Zanesville that a man named Sullivan was on board with them. That's how angry Zanesville got over the fact that Colonel Sullivan, a resident of that community, a prominent family of that community, was deciding that he was going to build the terminus of the railroad here in Bel Air. They wouldn't even use his name. If you go to the Zanesville history books, you're going to find very little written that's favorable to Colonel Sullivan. And in this particular account, newspaper account, history account, he wasn't even called by his name. It was just in reference to a man named Sullivan. Brought the Pataskala down the Muskingum River. They unloaded the Pataskala in Zanesville, and immediately it went to work on building the line between Zanesville and Newark. Now, where did the Pataskala, why did they get the Pataskala from Cleveland? Anybody have any ideas? Well, there were a lot of steam locomotive builders in the East, okay? And the original steam locomotive, the Pataskala, was actually built back east. It was built in the East, and it was transported through the Ohio River, the Erie Canal. And then in Cleveland, they took it off of a canal boat there, put it on a canal boat, and brought it down from Cleveland on the canal. And then when they got to what's the little town where Longenberger's was? Not Dresden. When they got to Dresden, they took it off of the canal boat there, put it on a flatboat, and brought it down to Zanesville. Because the Pataskala, first locomotive, you're saying that?
Well, no, I just can't believe that.
Yes, well, yeah, and I wish we had a photograph of the Pataskala, but I've searched everywhere and not been able to find it. These are locomotives that would be a type that would have been used at first when the Central Ohio Railroad began its operation. Now this one up here is called Lorain here. It was built in 1850 by Anthony Harkins in Cincinnati. So there also was locomotive builders here in the state of Ohio, in Cincinnati. And that's one that was built there. This is a Taunton locomotive, which was built in Boston, Massachusetts. And both of these are what we would call American Standard 440. 440. American Standard steam locomotives. The Newcastle Railroad Company, Newcastle and Frenchtown Railroad, was one of the first railroads back in the East, okay? And it was built in 1832, and it was extended from Newcastle, Delaware, to Frenchtown. Well, after they built that railroad, they saw a market evolving for the building of railroad locomotives. So they began to build railroad locomotives. Here are some examples of the locomotives back in 1832. That's the company that built the Pataskala. That's the company that built the Pataskala. And then shipped it from Delaware up to New York, up to the canal, down to Cleveland through the lakes, and then that locomotive was brought down to Zanesville. This is where they would have unloaded it, right here. This is the Muskingum River. This is the Licking River. They join confluence here. This is a picture of a wide bridge. This is where the Central Ohio Railroad Yard was back in the 1850s. Okay, here you see the railroad bridge that crosses. This would have been the railroad bridge that would have entered the yards back in the 1850s. Okay. The Newcastle Company built steam locomotives, and this is a locomotive that was built for the Philadelphia, Wilmington, and Baltimore Railroad in 1854. So this once again, it's called America. This is not the actual Pataskala, but this, because of the date in question, okay, and because it's built by the Newcastle Company, this is most likely what the Pataskala would have looked like, with an inclined driver. Okay. And once again, if I had a photograph of the Pataskala, I would. I'd love to have it, but just we can't find one. The Cincinnati Locomotive Works built very similar locomotives. So this would have been one of the locomotives built by Cincinnati, and it was built by the Moore and Richardson Company in Cincinnati, which had acquired the assets of a previous builder, Anthony Harkins. And this one is called the Nathaniel Wright. And it was built for the Little Miami Railroad in 1854. So once again, about the same time as the Central Ohio Railroad begins its operations, these are the kinds of locomotives that they would have been using. There was also another company, and this kind of enters into the anger of Zanesville. There was a group of engines built by Smith and Perkins. And Smith and Perkins were well-known locomotive builders, but they were back east, okay? They were in Alexandria, Virginia. And they commenced building steam locomotives in 1851. They built a steam locomotive that was actually a different kind of configuration. You see, this one is a, let's see, 2 wheels, 6 wheels, no wheels, okay? So that would be a 260. And they built one for the Central Ohio Railroad. This is one of the actual Central Ohio locomotives, and it was called the Black Hand. It was was built by the Virginia Locomotive and Car Manufacturing Company, the Black Hand. It was a 4-6-0. 4 wheels, front truck, 6 wheels, and no wheels. Okay? Anybody know why it might have been called Black Hand?
Black Hand Gorge.
Black Hand Gorge. How many people have been to Black Hand Gorge? Okay. We'll see some pictures of that here shortly. Black Hand Gorge is along the Lorain River. And there's a big rock face there that's called Black Hand Rock. And we won't go into the story about that because it will take too long. Okay. When this locomotive was ordered by the Central Ohio Railroad by Colonel Sullivan, this purchase was immediately sparking controversy with the Blandy Manufacturing Company in Zanesville, because the Blandy Company was a builder of steam engines, portable steam engines, but they also entered into the trade of building actual steam locomotives for railroads. This is an example of an advertisement that would have appeared for the Blandy Steam Engine Works in Zanesville, Ohio. 2 brothers. This is the kind of steam locomotive that they had previously built. Portable steam locomotive. Portable steam locomotives that could be used for sawmills. Portable steam locomotives that could be used for grinding grain, corn. But they had just entered into the actual building of steam locomotives, and because Colonel Sullivan was from Zanesville, and because they were contemporaries with each other, they entered into discussions that felt that they should have the lion's share of producing steam locomotives for the Central Ohio Railroad. They did, in fact, produce a couple of early steam locomotives. The first, after the Patasko arrived, they built a locomotive called Muskegon, and they built one called Zanesville. Those were the names of the locomotives. So they did build a couple of early steam locomotives. But there were other manufacturing companies as well, and one of those was Taunton in Massachusetts. And they had a track record of building steam locomotives. And Colonel Sullivan and the directors of the Central Ohio Railroad believed that they could get more reliable service out of a Taunton locomotive than they could out of the ones that the Blandys were building. And so that caused some animosity between Blandy and Zanesville Council, the municipal governments there that had invested so much money in the Central Ohio Railroad. Now, the Central Ohio roster of locomotives includes motive power acquired from other railroads. Okay? One of the reasons that this probably occurred was because there was a lack of funds. The Central Ohio Railroad was a poor railroad. Okay, so due to a lack of funds, and because they could get better credit terms from some of the other railroad companies or manufacturers, they chose to get locomotives from other railroads that had already been produced and that had already been in service on those roads. So the Kenton, the London, the Reindeer, which you previously saw a photograph of, the Elk locomotives, all of these were acquisitions that were made by the railroad by purchasing locomotives of other railroad companies that had already been in operation. And it was because of a lack of funds, better credit, and just imagine how much easier it would be to buy a steam locomotive for someone in Cincinnati than it would be to bring a locomotive down the Erie Canal to Cleveland and then down the the Muskingum River to Zanesville. It would be much, much easier for these locomotives to be acquired, much cheaper to do that. This is an example of the factory in Cincinnati of Anthony Harkness and Son, who produced many of these locomotives. And then here is a locomotive. Once again, this is produced by Moore and Richardson. Then Nathaniel Wright. That locomotive was produced after Anthony Harkness went out of business. This is a roster of the Central Ohio Railroad locomotives. Here you see the Pataskala, you see the Muskingum, you see Zanesville, Washington, Black Hand. You see these were built by Blaney. They say here the Pataskala, as I've said, is a Newcastle locomotive. They're also saying the Muskingum is a Newcastle locomotive. I don't know. But it was shortly after this that Blaney built a couple locomotives, and then they started to order locomotives from back east. And then you see later on, Blandy did produce some more locomotives. But Blandy, in Blandy's biography in Zanesville, if you read it, it says that they were basically shut out of the trade of building steam locomotives, and that they overbuilt, and that the locomotives that they had built and couldn't sell had to be sold at much, much cheaper prices than what they should have gotten. Okay, and so we think this is where many of these locomotives were actually ended up being purchased by the Central Ohio. Here's the thing about this. I wish I had a picture of the Pataskala. I wish I had photographs of a Blandy locomotive. I just, despite great efforts to find photographs, I haven't been able to find them. And the authorities don't always agree on these early locomotives. This is the best and most complete list of authorities that you can get to. This is a book, Steam Locomotives of B&O, all-time roster, William Edson in 92, B&O Power, locomotives shops in the United States in 1855. All of these can be solved. We have all of these books here at our library if you're interested in learning more about the production of steam locomotives back in the 1850s. Okay, now the difficulties of construction of the road. Let's talk about getting from Zanesville to Newark. Black Hand Gorge. Black Hand Gorge is through solid sandstone. That's what the railroad had to get through because they were right along the Licking River, but there were sandstone cliffs on both sides of the river. They had to get through Black Hand Gorge. And the second big area of difficulties was outside of Columbus when they were building on Columbus over Big Walnut Creek. And we'll show you some photographs of that. January 1852, Newark is reached, same time as the B&O is already in Wheeling. And then a year later, the road got completed to the state capital of Columbus. That would be 1853. Now, this is a photograph that I took at Black Hand Gorge. This is a bicycle trail today. But you can see the huge sandstone cliffs on both sides. That's used to be railroad tracks. That's the way you were able to get from Zanesville to Newark. Have you ever, any of our railroad locomotive engineers ever traveled that direction? Jess, have you ever gone through Black Hand Gorge? And I'm assuming no.
Further north.
Okay. Well, this is a photograph, and that's what they had to get through to get into Newark. They had to go through very, very difficult construction work at that time. The other difficult construction work was in Big Walnut Creek. just outside of Columbus. Anybody know where the approach is to the east-west runway at the Columbus Airport, where the airplanes fly right over the road? You'll pass under, on I-270, you'll pass under the railroad bridge that today is operated by the Ohio Central Railroad. And that bridge is actually the bridge that is over top of the highway, but originally it would have been on the ground level, approaching an embankment that would take you over Big Walnut Creek. Okay, this is a photograph of the bridge that crosses over Big Walnut Creek. There are several other arches that I couldn't get a photograph of. I had to climb down over this embankment, and it's a shale type of embankment that crumbles. It crumbles. I didn't actually scale that. I went down, on something that wasn't as steep as that. But the railroad had difficulty because every time they tried to put an embankment in, okay, on this side of the river, it crumbled. They had great difficulty being able to find stable area to place the embankment for that bridge. So that was a big problem for them. I had to, in order to get this photograph, I had to crawl out on a tree that was hanging over the river and wrap my legs around the tree.
Today they make drones.
Yeah, right. Yeah. You did that. Okay, so these were just minor problems compared to what they were going to face east of Zanesville. Because east of Zanesville, the unglaciated portion of Ohio, they were going to find the going much more difficult. Because now they were entering what we know as the Allegheny Plateau. And because it was to be located in Bel Air, that's where they wanted to terminate, there was another controversy with Wheeling over the route. Wheeling, of course, wanted it to go down Wheeling Creek. They wanted it to follow, get to Flushing and then follow Wheeling Creek down. Why? Because it would bring the railroad to Bridgeport, opposite Bridgeport. But if they had done that, they would face the same difficulties that the Cleveland, Lorain, and Wheeling ultimately faced because there was no way to get across the river, no economical way to get across the river. So Wheeling insisted that there be a second survey made. And the railroads had to hire Jonathan Knight to do a second survey. This is what the survey showed. The route to Bel Air. The route to Bel Air was going to be shorter in rail miles by 4 miles. In other words, it would be 4 miles shorter to go from Zanesville to Bel Air than it would be to go from Zanesville to Bridgeport. But the other part of that was the elevation. The elevation. It was going to be 323 feet higher at the Barnesville summit, and it would have been 323 feet lower at Flushing. So in other words, if you follow the Wheeling Creek route, you get to Flushing, okay, you don't have to go as high to get over the ridge. But you're going to be 4 miles further away from Wheeling. They ultimately decided that there was, they just weren't going to take the road to Wheeling, and they chose the route to Bel Air. And once again, I really think it was just geography that entered into that, perhaps more than anything else. Okay, so tunneling. There aren't any tunnels between Zanesville and Columbus that I know of. But there are 4 tunnels that would be between Zanesville and Bel Air. We would have tunnels at Cambridge, a tunnel at Barnesville, a tunnel at Warning, Storksville, and Georgetown. That's what, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, that's 5 tunnels, okay? To get through Guernsey and Belmont counties and over the Allegheny Plateau, you'd have to have tunnels. This is a photograph of the Georgetown tunnel looking toward Bel Air. That's looking east toward Bel Air. I took that photograph back when the rails were still in place. Oh, I'm sorry, wait a minute. This is looking west. This is the west quarter. That's looking towards Cape. This is coming into Bel Air, and this would be 2 miles west of Bel Air, and you can see they had to go through the Big Rock Cut to get across McMahon Creek, which is here where the bridge is. You see the bridge, and then beyond that is the tunnel. Here's the Barnesville summit. This is a photograph that's much more recent. There are no rails there now. And Barnesville is talking about putting in a walking trail, just like we have done here in Bel Air. This is the Storksville station, and if you look at the back, you can see the tunnel, the portal of the tunnel. This is headed toward Bel Air. So this would be the east portal of the tunnel, just beyond the train. It collapsed. Jess, they daylighted that tunnel, right?
Yeah.
Because it collapsed so much. So they decided we're just going to take the top of it off, leave it as a big cut. But it was at one time an actual tunnel. Okay, so operations begin. November 1st, 1854, the railroad, Central Ohio Railroad, made it to Bel Air, and operations began between Bel Air and Columbus. The road is built in the Ohio gauge of 4 feet 10 inches by state law. There were different gauges of railroad back in the 1850s. Some states decided that they wanted a particular gauge, and Ohio decided by statute that all railroads built had to be 4 feet 10 inches. But that is not the standard gauge, okay? And many other railroads built the standard gauge of 4 feet 8.5 inches. Okay, so that created problems with exchanging freight and passengers on cars that you wanted simply to transfer from one railroad to another. Okay, so I think we've already talked. Okay, this tells you about the debt. When the Central Ohio Railroad actually made it to Bel Air, look at the debt. $850,000 in floating debt owed to bondholders of the road, with 3 tiers of priority. First, second, and third tiers of priority. In other words, they had a lot more bondholders than they had collateral to secure those bonds. The former B&O president, Thomas Swan, and Johns Hopkins, we all know who Johns Hopkins is, the medical center, the great philanthropist of Baltimore. They were named as trustees for all of those bondholders. Why do you think they were appointed? Because many of the bondholders were in Baltimore. Because the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad also invested heavily in seeing that the Central Ohio was completed. Because they wanted to exchange freight and get further west. And all the while, Sullivan is facing an assault from Zanesville Council and the Blandys, seeking to have him removed as the president of the Central Ohio Railroad. In other words, they began a war against Sullivan because they wanted him removed, because they felt that he was selling out Zanesville interests, and Sullivan, was believing that he was doing what was in the best interest of the company, not just local interests. This is a photo of a bond was a $1,000 bond. This is what, the county of Belmont, the counties had to invest in the railroad, and when they did, they were issued these bonds. They were part of the bondholders, and you would only hope that you would not be a third or second tier of bondholders. Plans for crossing the Ohio River. Now, a lot of people think that because the bridge wasn't built until 1871, okay, that there wasn't thinking going on back at the time the Central Ohio reached Bel Air. That's not true. The deed that transferred the property to the railroad specifically said that this land is going to the railroad until such time as the building of a bridge to cross the Ohio River. So Wheeling was right. There was collusion. The Baltimore and Ohio had no intentions of going to Wheeling, and the Central Ohio and its president didn't want to go to Wheeling either. See, so it was clear there was collusion, but was it collusion for no good reason? I think it was of necessity. Okay, so the rail ferry that was to take place was to be between Benwood and Bel Air. Now, this is a map showing where the railroad initially came into Bel Air. This is from the west. The railroad came into car shops that were over here, and then there was this crescent-shaped track that went over to the Ohio River. Okay? And then this siding went down to the Ohio River bank. You see this crescent shape? If you folks got off at the interchange today, okay, and drove to the library, you passed over on Crescent Street. Crescent Street is a crescent shape because the railroad was there before Crescent Street was ever built. That's how Crescent Street got its name, is because it's in the shape of this crescent. Okay? You can see the name here, Bellair. There's no E. It was spelled multiple ways at that time. Sullivan gave the Central Ohio this road, or this area of land for the building of the engine house, the station, and freight yard, and the approaches to the Ohio River, which will be over here. 29.5 acres. Okay, the deed makes it clear that Bel Air is going to be the site of the bridge that will cross the Ohio River. Now, this is a map that was drawn back in 1855, I believe it is. This map hangs in the city building today. This is that crescent-shaped railroad track. This is the Crescent Street, okay? Trains would come over here. On the switchback, cars would be pushed down to the Ohio River bank and put on a barge. And that barge would be pushed across the Ohio River to a similar track here on the Virginia side. And now, this would be before the bridge, so it would be Virginia, Benwood, Virginia. And that's how freight and passenger cars were exchanged. Now, Wheeling was not done yet. Wheeling was still kind of angry. They filed a lawsuit, and the lawsuit that they filed was in Marshall County. Why Marshall County? Marshall County because that's where Benwood is, right? Is it Benwood in Marshall County? Okay, so they filed a lawsuit in Marshall County, and at this time it was Virginia. You see that? Richmond was where the Supreme Court ultimately decided that the steam ferry injunction that the local courts granted against the B&O were to be dissolved. And that allowed the train ferry agreement and the exchange of passengers and freight to go forward. 1855. Okay, now what did it look like? Well, the switchback was along the banks of the river, striking the water on a slope of 116 feet to the mile, 36 feet to low water mark. A barge would carry 10 cars each trip, double track on that barge. Track platform was adjustable to the stage of the river. So in other words, you could lower it when the water was low during drought periods. You could raise the platform higher in times of higher water or flooding. The barge had movable bow track, so it also could adjust to the level of the water. Locomotive power was used to load the railroad cars, not land power. Now this is an example of what that ferry would have looked like. Once again, we don't have photographs of the actual train ferry. Not only was there a train ferry here in Bel Air, but the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad also had a train ferry arrangement in Parkersburg, West Virginia, before the bridge, the railroad bridge across the Ohio River at Parkersburg. But this is what it looks like. You would bring the barge up to the track. There would be a platform that would lower and adjust to the barge, and then a locomotive would pull the cars off, or they could load by pushing them on. This is a model, a scale model that was built by the noted model railroad builder, John Bowman, the late John Bowman in Wheeling, West Virginia. He built this at my request, and it is now on display here at the Bel Air Public Library upstairs. But this is what it looked like. You would have a locomotive, and this particular locomotive was called the Brown Dick. Brown Dick was the name given to a very famous racehorse during the 1850s. Okay, so now, after the Central Ohio and B&O began exchanging freight and passengers, and they do this by way of the train ferry, there was still this problem that the railroads were going to have to figure out, because the Ohio Railroad was in the gauge of 4 feet 10 inches, the Ohio gauge, but B&O was built in the gauge of 4 feet 8.5 inches. So railroads began to try to come up with solutions to this problem of transferring railroad cars from one railroad to another. And so there were various ways that they tried to come up with a solution. One of those was compromise wheels. Compromise wheels with a wider tread on each of the wheels, so that if they were transferring a car that was standard gauge to a wider gauge, Ohio gauge 4 feet 10 inch, that the wheel would be able to still stay on that track. In other words, it would fit. The wheel was wider, so it could accommodate a wider gauge car. And that's the reason why they called them compromise wheels. It was compromise. And then there were sliding wheels. Axles where the wheels could actually be moved slightly so that they could accommodate the difference in gauges. Some a third rail. Sometimes they would simply, depending upon the gauge, if they could put a third rail, one single third rail, in between, say, the Ohio gauge rails, okay, then they would be able to run the cars on one of the Ohio gauge wheels and on this third rail, not even wider. And then there was a crane used at some points to actually move car bodies from one set of wheels trucks to another set of wheel trucks. You know, none of these were very economical. They caused many derailments and many accidents. And so it was necessary for the rebuilding of the rails this gives you an example here of what we're talking about. If this is a standard gauge, okay, and you're going to go to a wider gauge where this rail, instead of being here, is going to be over here, what you can do is widen the tread of each of these wheels, okay, and that would allow you to actually transfer it to the Ohio gauge track. Okay, Bel Air had a busy traffic on the river. This is from Harper's Weekly during the Civil War. Now this is before the bridge was built. Okay, and here's the railroad depot along the Ohio River. This would have been where there would have been a decline along the riverbank to where the ferry boats, you know, with the barge, it actually moved the traffic back and forth across the Ohio River. But the you know, the ferry agreement was still had the problems to deal with of nature. Okay? This is a picture of the Ohio River at South Bel Air in drought. I mean, that's hard to believe. Somebody is standing in the river taking a picture, and that's the river. That's where the river is supposed to be. That's drought. Then there were problems of flooding. This is the winter of 1929. Okay, this is also another flood situation. So flood, ice, and drought was a constant enemy that attacked railroad operations on the Ohio River. So it was necessary that there was going to have to be a bridge. Okay, so they tried to plan the approach when they decided there was going to be a bridge. Okay, that is an approach to come from the west into Bel Air to be able to get high enough elevation to be able to approach a bridge that could cross the river without interfering with barge traffic. Okay, the McMahon Creek approach followed the creek south, low to the creek area. It would have required huge embankments to be able to get the railroad tracks at an elevation to approach a bridge. There was the 31st Street approach, which would go right through the heart of the town, right smack dab through downtown Bel Air. And there were some people that didn't like that. And then there was the North Bel Air approach, where the railroad tracks would have gone up to North Bel Air, where there would have been higher elevation at Gravel Hill. But what sits opposite Gravel Hill in the Ohio River? Boggs Island. Boggs Island. Same kind of problem that you had at Wheeling, you would also have in North Bel Air. So the 31st Street approach is what was used. But there was controversy over, you know, which of these to use. And most of this controversy came from Bel Air residents. Village Council and Colonel Sullivan went almost hand-to-hand combat as to which one of these should be chosen. Sullivan wanted the 31st Street approach, which is where the bridge is today. But there were people on council, primarily one of his competing landholders here in the town, a man by the name of Morgan, E.G. Morgan. And he would not agree to allow them to use the 31st Street approach unless they insisted that there be embankments. And if you would have used embankments like dirt, okay, you would have basically cut off the town, you know, in two sections. Sullivan wanted something that would allow passage. And so he went to council on January 14, 1864, and he urged council to approve the 31st Street approach. But Morgan objected and said that he thought there should be an embankment. They couldn't come to an agreement motion made to have the 31st Street approach, but the motions that were made to do that died for lack of a quorum. There were actually council members who got up and walked out so that they couldn't take a legal vote to approve an agreement. Nothing has changed in the council these days. I mean, we've been how many years, and nothing important can be decided easily. So 2 years later, in January of 1866, council then approved the construction over 31st Street. This is what it said. The construction can be stone, brick, or iron, or any combination of two. No obstruction of streets, no embankment. Restrictions were removed on the height and the width. All of this was decided here on the second floor of the first Bel Air City building. The first stone of the river piers was laid on May 2nd, 1868. Stone was transported, Michael, from Grafton, Ohio, Lorain County, very close to where you're from. And it was transported to face the river piers. Why did they go to Lorain County for the sandstone that would be used for placing the piers of the river? They went there because there's a very tightly compacted, hard grain of sandstone that comes from the Cuyahoga County area. In Lorain County, there were large quarries there. And we don't know exactly how that stone got transferred to Bel Air, because at that time, the Cleveland, Lorain, and Wheeling Railroad had not reached, in the 1860s, 1867, it was not yet to Bridgeport.
Didn't even start until the 1871.
Yeah, so how did it get here? I raised that question at the mini-con in Grafton last year. Nobody really had an answer. But it did. But these stones all came from Grafton, Ohio. And you see these icebreakers? These are icebreakers that jut out on the north side of those piers. Now, if you go to the river today and look at those icebreakers, the river is up about here. This is how much damming of the Ohio River has raised the water level. So you don't see those icebreakers like you did when this photograph was taken back in the 1870s. This was a photograph that Michael also had that shows Bel Air, Ohio, here on this side of the river. This is Benwood. And if you look over here, you see this incline, you see this line that goes up the bank of the river? That's the track to the ferry. And if you look right here, a gentleman and I exchanged correspondence and photographs, and he blew this photograph up, and he determined that in fact is the train ferry that was used, that's the barge that was used to transport prior to the actual building of the bridge. This is the original bridge span. Once again, this is in Benwood, West Virginia now, looking over at Bel Air. We're not going to go through all of this. There were Bowman spans and Linville bridge spans. Wendell Bowman and Linville were famous bridge builders for the Baltimore and Ohio. The Great Stone Viaduct, which you see passing through Bel Air, was 1,433 feet in length, consists of 43 sandstone arches. The total length of the bridge from the approach here, where our walking trail begins, to over in West Virginia, to where the approach goes off, was 3,843 feet, not counting the embankments of the approaches on each side of the river. But the bridge immediately was despised by riverboat captains because the river One was 322 feet, and the other was 220 feet. And the pier, get this, the piers, one of the piers was struck by the steamboat Star in the winter of 1869 before the bridge even got built. It had just come up, built up just above the water level, and the steamboat Star struck one of those piers and sank with loss of life. In 1871, after the bridge was completed, 6 steamers hit the bridge piers over a period of just 3 days. And then it was struck by 6 steamboats in 1874 during 1 month. So, you know, this bridge was not wide enough, in the opinion of the maritime community. This is the May Channel span. This is a photograph that I took of a coal train headed across the river to Wheeling. This is what's amazing to me. These piers that you see here were struck by 25 steamers in the decade after its completion, which was 10 more than either the bridge at Parkersburg or at Steubenville. And so today it still is a dangerous passage. The stone viaduct construction commenced in 1870. Here you see the keystone down at Union Street. If you go down to Union Street, you'll see in that arch, this is designating the date that actual construction began. This is a view of 31st Street as it's headed west toward Rose Hill. 43 sandstone arches. Piers rise 10 to 20 feet above the natural surface of the ground. The arches are spaced 33 feet, 0.4 inches from center to center. You get down there with a tape measure, that's what we'll measure out there. Above each arch is a 6-foot parapet, capped with a retaining wall. 36 ring stones line each arch with 1 keystone for a total of 37 stones. This bridge was built just after the conclusion of the Civil War. And at the time, there were 37 states preserved in the United States by the ending of that war. And these 37 stones in each of the arches represent one of those states. Very symbolic. This is a photograph that was taken from high up on the hill, high up on Rose Hill. Here is the old roundhouse that was built by the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad. The original Central Ohio Railroad, not a roundhouse, but an engine house, was on this side of the bridge. This is a photograph that was taken in 1872, 1 year after the completion of the bridge. How many people do you see in that photograph? I'm not looking for you, if I tell you that. How many do you see? You see, okay, we don't know who that is. But I do know that that photograph was taken from just outside the residence of Colonel Sullivan on Rose Hill, where Colonel Sullivan lived. I don't know that that's him, but I know, history doesn't allow me to say it's him, but I kind of think it might be. But there's another person in that photo. Anybody see the other person?
Below him?
Where?
Below him?
Right here at the bottom.
Right here?
Yeah.
There's a little barefooted girl in a little dress that's standing on the fence. Right here. You see that? Today, there's a walking trail that will take you out to Guernsey Street, all the way around this bridge, back to 26th Street, where the trailhead is located. This is just an old Davis camel that was sitting in the freight yard there. This would be where the plaza is today, where the Great Stone Plaza is today. This is a bird's eye view of Bel Air in 1882. Now, I taught a local history course, and I told the students that there were 43 arches in this bridge. The lithographer probably didn't accurately count the number of arches because the student told me that he counted the arches and there were 2 missing. Okay, but the actual bridge does have 43 arches. This is the view that I took a photograph of out of the house where Colonel Sullivan lived on Rose Hill before the home was raised, before it was torn down. This was the second floor window, and I went up there, up the stairs, very narrow stairs, and I went up there, and I was able to snap this photo out of the window. And Sullivan obviously had a beautiful view of the bridge after it was built. You remember I told you who the first president of the Central Ohio Railroad was? Solomon Sturgis. Solomon Sturgis. This is the monument in, I think it's called Green Lawn Cemetery in Zanesville. Huge, huge, huge monument to his memory. This is a much smaller family monument where Colonel Sullivan is buried today.
Where is that?
In Green Lawn Cemetery in Zanesville.
Both of them in Zanesville.
I'm sorry, yes, there, yeah. In fact, if you look up here, you see this? You see the top of that monument? That's Sturgis' monument up above the tree. Sullivan's is very much smaller, and he's sharing the monument with members of his family.
So is that up the hill just above the Y Bridge?
If you were going to go to Green Lawn, it's not the one that you see along the interstate. What you're going to do is you're going to get off. You're going to go. Do you know how to get to Putnam Hill? Okay. You're going to follow the road out. You're going to follow the road south, past Putnam Hill. Okay, and that's where you're going to run into the cemetery up there. In fact, on the way, you're going to pass a street named Sullivan Street.
That's south of 7th. That's south.
That would be on the south side of Interstate 70. Yeah. This is in the very old part of Green Lawn Cemetery. So this is a monument that was placed in the Bel Air Park, called Union Park, in 2003 as a part of the Ohio Bicentennial to commemorate the life of Colonel Sullivan. Because he was an individual, he was really a remarkable individual, in spite of all the things that happened during his life. It was erected in 2003. It's noticed that he is the founder of the late 19th century Bel Air, Ohio. The area where we are today, all the way up to the park, was platted, okay, by Sullivan. He was president of the Central Ohio Railroad, and later he became the president of the Bel Air and Southwestern Narrow Gauge Railroad that also went to Zanesville. He was an agent for the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad in the Civil War, and in fact, he was appointed by President Abraham Lincoln to the first board that became the United States Agriculture Department. He was the representative of Ohio, appointed by Lincoln. He was the proprietor of the Star Glass Works and the Sullivan Coal Company here in Bel Air. And he was an advocate for the modern community, which he basically founded by bringing the railroad here to Bel Air. That really is the conclusion. But If anybody wants to see that, you'll be able to find that marker in the park. This particular marker bears these words. And I think they're worth repeating. And these words came from the speech that he gave in 1852, congratulating the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad and Wheeling when the B&O reached Wheeling in 1852. He was talking about those people who envisioned the building of a railroad to the Ohio River. Oh,
You got to quit. Here we go.
and he said these words in complimenting Thomas Swan, who was the president of the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad. He said, what am I doing? I'm getting too close.
Yeah, getting in the
It
path.
says, he says, they could hear more distinctly than others the footsteps of coming generations. And I think that's true of him as well. He could hear the footsteps of what could become a community here on the Ohio River more distinctly than a lot of other people could hear it. That's all I have, and hope you enjoy it. If there are no questions, I'll leave you on this afternoon.
Okay. But where did it all go?
Right.
To see how the railroads and that came in here and Wheeling and Ohio County, it's sad, there's not 1 inch of railroad left in Wheeling.
Yeah. You know, there's an interesting story. Let's see, who was here? You were in Wheeling at the convention. You were telling me that you were at the convention where I had spoken. And when I was at that convention, there was a fellow there that was talking about Wheeling and this, that, and the other. You know, it was at a time when the railroads had all been taken up. The railroads were all cool in Wheeling. There are no railroads in Wheeling at all.
Not zero.
And he made comments of something about why would somebody come to Bel Air? And, you know, I pointed out to him, well, you know, these people are here to talk about railroads. And if you want to see a train, you're going to have to come to Bel Air because there aren't going to be Wheeling. And that is unfortunate. You know, the things that we did when we were kids